This is the beginning of Psych 1 first lecture, and we have to have a definition of psychology, and I have the study of individual behavior and experience. Um, the book talks about goals of science, and there's descriptive where you describe what you're studying. There is control when you try to control experiments. It talks about explain how explain behavior, and it talks about predicting behavior. And on the test, I'm going to ask you of the four, which is the most important, and the one is predict behavior. If we can't predict behavior, what good is it? So the so on the test, you got to remember predict behavior. There are 53 different areas of psychology. Forensic psychology, health psychology, sports psychology, consumer psychology, clinical psychology. And they are all governed by the American Psychological Association. On the test, do not put APA, because that could be the American Porno Society. Association. So what you want is, I want you to write it out. The American Psychological Association is the governing body of psychology. And we have to know the difference between a psychiatrist, which is a medical doctor who studied psychology, and a psychologist who basically has a master's or PhD in psychology, but is not a medical doctor. The big difference is that psychiatrists can prescribe drugs, a psychologist cannot. Okay. Even though we have been, mankind or humankind has been studying or trying to explain behavior since the beginning of time, psychology is considered a young science, a new science, about 140 some years old. Now we can go all the way back to 334 BC when Aristotle wrote Parapsyche, which was considered the first psych book, because he talks about the main driving force of humans is hedonism, seek pleasure and avoid pain. That's what Freud said. Freud considered the father of psychology, the main driving force. So obviously we can go back to ancient Greece, but still it's considered a young science. We also talk about Democritus, and Democritus was another Greek philosopher, and he's the one that separated mind and body, because sometimes our mind does not do what our body wants to be done. And then obviously the last one we want to talk about, because we're not going to go through the history of psych here, is Socrates, because Socrates said we cannot trust our perceptions. Sometimes we misperceive. Like we see somebody crying, we think they're sad, but they may be crying because they're super happy about something. So psychology grew out of two things: philosophy and medicine or biology. Philosophy is the father, because Phil, that's male's name, and then medicine is the mother of psychology. Psychology started in 1879, because that was the first time we had a psych lab, or the word psychology was used at Leipzig University. So that's why it's considered a young science, because it supposedly started really as psychology by itself in 1879. That goes us back to structuralism. There are 8 isms in the textbook, but in reality there's only 4. Now that sounds confusing, but I'm going to make sense of that in a few minutes. Structuralism was the first psychology. The key is structure. This is from Wundt. And many people think he is the actual father of psychology, because he taught almost all the famous earlier psychologists when psychology started to grow in the science world. But Wundt wanted to break things down like the medical model to its basic elements. To understand them, you got to break them down to basic elements, the medical model. And so he ended up thinking that everything was either a sensation or a perception. You break everything down, it's either a sensation or a perception. He used introspection, which is not a very good way of gathering information. Introspection is looking into oneself in order to explain behavior. And he would have people explain what they were feeling or sensing. during eating or during pain or something. But basically, then you're just getting one person's opinion. So one person's freedom fighters, another person's terrorists, and so it wasn't the best way to gather information. Matter of fact, introspection came to the United States with Tishner, one student. He started the psych school at Cornell, and when Tishner finally passed away, we've had a lot better, better methods of gathering information than using introspection. I'm going to stop here to make sure this thing works, and then I'll pick up where we left off in a minute.